Milwaukee community at large. Of course, we're always happy to have everybody attend who can. And today I'm actually going to introduce Leslie Vanson to introduce our speaker, Leslie Smith III. So, come on up.
It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight and to also acknowledge with great appreciation the financial support for Leslie Smith's presence at UWM today from Art Design's John Colt Fund. Leslie Smith is an assistant professor of art at UW-Madison, where he has been teaching since the fall of 2010. He earned his MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale in 2009, and his BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. Immediately following his graduation, completing his graduate work at Yale, Leslie Smith was a summer fellow at the American Academy in Rome and then taught for a year at the University of Hartford in Connecticut before coming to Madison. Smith's Wisconsin exhibitions include a 2014 solo exhibition at the Riston Galleries at Lawrence University, a 2013 one-person exhibition at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, participation in the Wisconsin 30 exhibition that accompanied Milwaukee Art Museum's 32nd show, and a 2012 solo show in Milwaukee's Dean Jensen Gallery. In addition to these Wisconsin exhibitions, in the 5 short years since completing his MFA work, Leslie Smith has exhibited in galleries in San Francisco, New York, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Miami, Cincinnati, Montgomery, and Birmingham, Alabama, and in 2014, just now completed at Houston's Contemporary Art Museum in the exhibition titled Black in the Abstract Part 2. That makes me out of breath with that much work in 5 years. Please welcome Leslie Smith.
All right, so I'm going to do a few very important things. First, I'm going to move this up here so that I can be heard. So that's good. That's close enough. Great. The other thing I'm going to do is set a timer. Oh. All right, what about now? Is this better? No?
Well, you can start on your shirt and not your jacket.
Is that good? Yes. That's all right? Perfect. I'm going to set a quick timer because, let's see, I think it's still my notes. I was going to say something about that, so it made me realize those right there. Set a timer because at times I can kind of go on at length. I want to make sure I stay abreast of the time moving so we have time for questions, if there are any. So, first, I want to say, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure getting this phone call last year, inquiring about the visit. I've enjoyed my time here all today. This is my first time visiting UW-Peck and UWM School of Art. And I've got to say sincerely that I've enjoyed all of my meetings with people here. And I wouldn't say that I didn't, you know what I mean? But I do sincerely mean that I did. Everyone was different. The community of artists here are extremely diverse. And in my experiences in art institutions, which I feel like I've spent most of my life in, either as a student or a professor or something, diversity of student community in terms of interest in art is super important. It shows real strong signs, strength. And so both undergrad and graduate, if I've met with you and you're here, I really enjoyed that meeting. I hope you did the same. Thank you to Leslie for orchestrating this. And I will say that it's very hard for me to say thank you to Leslie because it's like I'm talking to myself. And it's funny because our emails back and forth, I've deleted many of them because I tend to email myself things, and when I see you pop up, I'm like, oh yeah, get rid of that. And then I realized later that it's relatively important. So, but anyhow, I'm going to get started, and I don't really care for podiums too much, mainly because they intimidate me. I like to kind of talk with folks. I have notes, and I've got a number of them, but it's because I'm legally blind, and they're at 20-point size. And that does tie into the way I see things, and why I've made this journey from representation to abstract along a lot of other more academic reasons I could talk about as well. But these just help me stay online. I might not get to everything, but I do plan on trying to talk about the duration of time, or the duration of time from my thesis show in graduate school and kind of now, skipping some not interesting times on the way, but making sure to show a few things that makes sense in terms of how to develop and to regentrify practice after leaving a graduate program, or how to reinvent and to get more vigor out of some of the crucial ideas that help generate your work that at an earlier state are present but aren't maybe distilled to a concentrated amount to kind of last and constantly be turned over. So I'll start by saying something pretty anecdotal. I think that artist lectures are generally boring, and I understand that at least when I was in school I'd go to them and I would only expect it to be informative. But I think things have kind of changed and expectations are different. And I do think that in addition to them being informative, they also might have to be a little self-exploitive, meaning that a goal of mine today is to kind of open up and give a glimpse into the studio practice and kind of, at least I hope, demystify some of the reasons why I make the paintings that I made. I also think that they generally need to be a little entertaining, as to prevent people from falling asleep, which I've been one of those persons many times. And when I think of it that way, I tend to think of the role of contemporary painting kind of being the same thing. It's got to be a little bit informative in order for it to work. It's got to be relatively accessible in terms of exposing something about the artist in some shape or form, and even maybe a little entertaining in order to hold that attention long enough to create a very emotive or good viewing experience for people. And so I say this not because I try to think of this when I make my paintings, but I try to stay cognizant of the kind of expectations from the audiences. Because I think that's really a reflection of what it is that it's like the receiving end of conversation. And for me, making paintings is about having a conversation. The goals for me at times are to create visual language that we can understand, that we can share experiences over, that go beyond something written or something spoken, but that work within the realm of the visceral, right? Things that we all understand. We respond to color very similarly. We react to scale in very similar ways as just human beings, even though us, culture and society, at times can deem us as being separate or categorized in different sects or groups or whatever. And so that aspect of the communicative values of making art is super important to me. And then the last kind of anecdotal thing I'll throw out there is something that I refer to quite often in the studio is a question that is phrased by Michael Alpines, a curator at the Museum of Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. And the question is something simple. It says, I'll have to read it because I don't want to butcher it. It's how can you tell the truth and yet still be an artist who's compelling to people? I think that's pretty interesting. It goes back to the idea of being a little exploited in a way. How can you tell the truth? Because if you're totally explicit in what you do, then perhaps it's not interesting, right? There's no game involved. And that's something that I always think about when I get myself into kind of quandaries about when am I making work about again, or how am I making this work? And think about, does it fulfill these, is it alluring enough? Is it subversive enough? Is it real enough? So anyhow, a little bit about the content of my work, and then I'll kind of get thrown into things. At the moment, and over the duration of time that I'm going to talk about today, I've made work in some shape or fashion about how we relate to each other, how we respond to each other, the powers that exist in how we think about ourselves, how we operate in common spaces with people, the type of contentious relationships that can exist within everyday human experiences. At a certain point, I thought of this as being always attached to some type of platform, and I think now, more or less, I think about it more abstractly. At a time, I was interested in illustrating this idea, and now I'm less concerned with illustrating it as and more interested in kind of creating conceptual mechanisms, right, that take or can take these inferences and kind of directly inform the assertion of paint, so that the object itself that's at the end of this process represents excuse me, the more complex notions with how we coexist, the things that we can't quite bring words to, the type of abstract emotion that comes from, let's say, a Kafka aphorism, or in that space. So, I started, where have I started, right? So I decided to show this painting. It's called Yesterday's Great American Patriot. It's the earliest piece that I've got shown up today. It was made in 2008. And it's a self-portrait. I generally do one every year, but in 2008, I started thinking about ways of illustrating these ideas. I was seeking for a platform, something that would give me the opportunity to talk about these complex issues. I was seeking for signifiers, seeking for archetypes. I considered the idea of working in somewhat of the double nature of commedia dell'arte, which is the Italian theater, the type of satirical qualities by precast characters that everyone knew, right? So everyone in the audience knew the type of performance of each character. They knew what they represented. It kind of operated in a sitcom type way. It seemed to be the perfect place to make paintings from. I am absolutely influenced by Philip Guston, and we'll talk about him a number of times today. And I've got a small clip I'd like to show if we have time about Philip Guston in the studio. And I saw kind of an idyllic approach to commedia dell'arte and Guston's work in terms of how he turns figures, how he turns objects, how he turns form, environments, even the physicality of the paint into a functional character. It's all emotively communicating something. I was really influenced by Kiriko. I love his paintings for a number of reasons, but more or less, it's more so, his paintings became influential to me because of the way he developed his characters. Unlike a lot of artists who use this as a platform, his characters are not really specific in the way of identifying them in terms of how we would identify our best friend. That person has black hair, 5'7", he takes a much more analytical approach to how he, starts to articulate the relationship between two people, like in this painting, the archaeologists, by comprising their energy with what it is that they love. And I think that this is pretty interesting to think of a character as not necessarily always being figurative, but also being structural, or being kind of a collaboration of recognizable forms and objects that we all can kind of relate to. So I kind of moved along and started making my own cast of characters. And I'm sure everyone's kind of heard that term before. If you've ever had a love affair with Philip Guston, you hear it all the time. And my cast of characters were all taken from the type of interrogation processes found in Abu Ghraib in Guantanamo Bay. And the work prior to this, it was extremely political. And I don't know if this is from Washington, D.C., and kind of surrounded by all the hypocrisy and all this stuff. But maybe that might be an easy way to talk about it. But I'm just interested in the power dynamics that exist inside of policy, specifically the petty stuff. And when I was searching in grad school for a platform to make these paintings from, it made sense to think of the most local scenario. And so, flipping through Time magazine and seeing those images from Abu Ghraib be kind of disseminated to the masses and seeing the response, it just got me interested. Started doing a bunch of research. Realized that the violent aspect was horrific, right? But what I found much more challenging to digest was the soft power that was being used, the psychological power that was being imposed, that was happening within the four walls of the interrogation room. And that interrogation room became the kind of environment for my paintings. And I started flipping through videos, documentaries, and images, looking for significant things that mean something to me and mean something different to the person implicated. The first thing was this white chair. For me, it's what we ate watermelon in, or what we had, kind of like barbecue in. But for a detained grub, it's kind of quite the difference. It's much more of a symbol of like monumental, like torturous device. The idea of the high heel and the leg that fits into it became somewhat of a character for me. The idea of dehumanizing Arab men by relying on cultural tableaus or taboos in order to break down social walls as a means of softening up became something of interest to me. It leaves no marks, but it's super. I mean, for me, it's kind of frightening. I can imagine the kind of Western world version of that. And all of these ideas kind of coalesce together within this very theatrical moment that exists in this painting titled Piss Chair, which is 10 feet by 9 feet by 8 feet, of where my idea was kind of ubiquitous with familiar modes of expressionism from the New York School of Painting, for example. But also kind of embedded was this tale or cryptic sense of theater, that something was about to happen or something had already happened, but I was not interested in that exact moment. The kind of like incorporation of all these archetypes together, kind of intermingling amongst each other, would be suggestive of something that I was hoping that my viewer would, kind of figure out. I continued making these paintings for a year after, trying to get at more of the psychological aspects of this situation. I started relying on objects that would function as characters that had very little baggage, that meant very little. I mean, when I say, hey, what do you think about when you see a white chair? Yeah, who really cares? So I can kind of load it, right? I can like load that with a bunch of information. I say, what do you think about pipes? Well, it doesn't have too many culturally relevant, or it doesn't have much cultural relevance in terms of baggage. So it became something that I could repurpose in a way, and my intentions were that the way I repurpose it would inform you to what it was I was interested in. I'm not saying that was successfully achieved with these paintings, but that's where my mind was. I ended, that experience with this painting titled Peter, 6 by 6 feet, and it kind of changed everything for me. I had been put underneath or kind of put on the coals, if you will, in graduate school for the type of work I was making, purposely so, and I mean, they had every right to hold me accountable for the work that I was making. And I was challenged to make a piece of work that had the same amount of emotional gravitas, but found that, or got to that, not necessarily through the imagery, but through the physical nature of the painting. Like, pretty much test this visual language, test this stability, right? See if this vernacular actually works. I mean, take it away from the recognizable and the somewhat shocking color and kind of gory nature of the paint, and see what's left. And so I started thinking about, well, what would be the best topic for this? And so I generated this image, which is essentially borrows the language of that bagged character from that first painting, and kind of isolates it in this singular cell. And something happened. The response to the painting was great. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good because someone responded to it great, but I enjoyed it as well, and spent the next 2 years trying to figure out exactly what it was that I was interested in that painting, why it worked. And like I said, it happened at the end of grad school. When I left grad school and after the American Academy of Rome, it was pretty much just like filling up the tank with seeing works that I'd never seen before. In person, I made very little work on that trip. When I got back and decided to move to New York, one of the first things that hit me in terms of why that piece might have been successful is because when that painting language got ripped away from the objects or the identifiable components, it started to assert itself as being something that didn't look as if it was burdened, right? So the type of didactic presence those images had was no longer there. And I think in terms of an audience could gain access to the imagery a lot faster. And I thought that there was potential with that. And that potential lied in the notion that you can't make work about things you don't know about, right? And so I did all the research I possibly could around that topic. But the only way for that work to grow was if I had written an extremely persuasive grant and got sentenced to be kind of psychologically tortured. That was the only way to make that work and to make it in the realm of expressionism. Much like the reason why post-World War II German expressionism can't be made today, because it's not as if right now many of us are up against the wall of understanding that at any given moment we could just vanish due to powers that are much larger and greater to us. And so, unlike a number of folks thinking about the context of German expressionism and why that works, it makes sense that the work had to be more about me, something that I had kind of ran away from for a while. And once again, the idea of how do you tell the truth, like really come to terms with what, or really come to truth with what it is that you respond to in the world. I made this painting, one of the first ones I made in New York, and it was titled "Hungry Boy." And it was, I don't know, it's kind of very literal. I was hungry, literally hungry for time, hungry for work, hungry for a studio, and all that stuff. I was after about 2 weeks of the kind of infatuation with the synthetic level of New York, you realize that despite how many people you know, that town, the island of Manhattan is extremely small and gets old very fast. And I thought about what would be an archetype for that, what would be a symbol for that, and of course I thought about the Lord Dead. It's like, what else is synthetic, gets old really fast, tastes bad, is not fulfilling. And so I'm still working within this idea of trying to find objects, recognizable things that I can recontextualize to bring meaning into the paintings. And it got me to start thinking that maybe that needed to change. And one thing that kind of struck a chord with me was going back to that painting, the Peter painting, to try and figure out what was it that I was attracted to in there. And was there anything in there that could help me figure out and further define what it was that I wanted? And so I think I was at Sycamore Jenkins, and I think that's what it was, and I saw this Amy Simon show. And I've been looking at Amy Simon paintings for a while. Carol Dunham and that kind of whole school of figurative abstraction. With Carol Dunham more figurative than abstraction, of course. And it kind of hit me over the head when I seen this. Why I was attracted to Peter so much. And I don't mean that like in a narcissistic way of like saying, oh, when I walked in here, Amy Simon was doing what I was doing. No, I mean it in the sense that I had tapped onto a certain ratio of figuration and abstraction, a certain ratio of representation and ambiguity that was appeasing to me. And I stumbled across it, and Amy Silman at the time, and continually does it, was exploiting it to the nth degree, like really making it work for her. There's a certain suggestive quality to the role of drawing in these paintings that I found solace in. There's an interesting relationship between the abstract space that exists behind here, both structural and atmospheric, that is equal in relevancy to how we kind of engage atmosphere or our own environmental spaces. And I thought that was pretty cool. I continued on to thinking, well, what makes the perfect painting? What do I need? I went back to Gustin because that's like home base in a way. I used to just not talk about it, and just I'm not going to talk about Phil because if I don't bring it up, then people will just believe I'm not crazy. And it got to the point where at the end of every lecture I get these questions. Well, have you thought about Phil Gustin? I'm like, have I thought about Phil Gustin? And I'm just like, let me share about everything. So I'm like, just make it part of the lecture explicitly. And so there's the idea of the singular, and I hate to say that, like the idea of the blank word, but like it's the notion of monumentality, monolithic. One statement, everything all inclusive. There's something about that as just an aesthetic, a design aesthetic, a painting aesthetic that I find fairly attractive because I think it helps organize the space. It organizes the space of the canvas in a way that really makes it so that whatever's at the forefront of that narrative, you can't escape. you can't get lost in the pink behind stuff or this. You have to deal with this. This painting is called Martyr, and it's pretty great because someone's been martyred, but like the body's gone and like there's nothing but these sticks. And if anyone wants to take a stab at trying to define what that thing is back there, the white thing that looks like an arm. Yes.
No, I don't.
Huh?
No, I don't.
Oh.
I was just saying, yeah.
Oh, I mean, I always throw it out there because I'm flabbergasted. I don't know what that is. It's not an arrow, and I wish I could ask him what it is because it could make this piece either really good or really bad. And so I went back to the drawing table. That was the same time when I moved to Madison and left New York, and everyone was like, "What are you really? Are you in New York? You come to Madison?" And I was like, and they were better yet, they're like, "Where is Madison?" I was like, "It's in Milwaukee." Because that helped, right? And I was like, "It's great, I got this awesome opportunity," and they're like, "Give me this hard time." And I was like, "Look, man, like I have 9 hours a week in the studio in New York, which is beans. You can't do nothing for 9 hours a week in the studio. At least I can." And here, I was like, "Man, I'm gonna have like almost every day I can paint in the studio, and for good portions of time." And so when I got here, it was the perfect time to kind of hit the reset button. I mean, I came here with 6 boxes. 5 of those were studio materials, and 1 was kind of bike, and I just kind of started all over again. And I started thinking about separating the character, the act of creating a character, from the act of creating a narrative. And so I went through this sequence of just kind of dumb drawings, thinking of attributes that I was interested in. So something that was relatively heroic, the gross guy that you see at the bar. Some weird interior-exterior business. And all those things kind of started to turn into paintings. This painting is Gladiator, and it was pretty interesting that I was making these paintings, and I look back at now, and I'm like, I don't think I can ever make those things. I don't really truly know what they're about, thematically speaking, but kind of systematically speaking for the studio, they were about creating a type of palette, a type of space, and starting to become more specific about all the different conditions of a painting. I was exploring how to deal with the type of perceptual space that I was interested in. I was dealing with the role of color in my paintings. I was borrowing from the day-to-day situations that I was encountering all the time to be the kind of narratives of these paintings. This painting in particular is called Airplane. And I mean, when I first moved out here, my fiance at the time was back in New York. I mean, I was flying to New York, twice a month just to kind of keep up with the things that I had already committed to. And so I don't know, these forms, when I sat down, I was like, "What do you want to paint today?" These forms just kept on popping out. This painting is called Near Window. I like this one. This painting is titled Speak Up. They found their way to get political again. I can't help that. I don't know what that's about quite yet. But one thing that came out of, like, let's say this painting and this one here was this notion of like collapsing the space, right? And making the painting operate as like an identifiable subject in the middle, or something that functioned figuratively, but then it would kind of factor into a larger network of things that would make the painting operate as one solid thing, where there's just absolutely no space, no foreground, no background. Every thing is kind of isolated and buttoned up perfect against the next thing, like the jigsaw puzzle. I thought I was ready to move on, and I made this painting after making a ton of those 27 by 27 inch paintings, and this was one of the better ones of them. And I got really infatuated with the veil. In the same way, I got infatuated with like the high heel, the chair, and other inanimate objects that I thought I could, put meaning into, or make cathartic in many ways. That translated into a series of paintings that just started to be about the physicality of paint and the insertion of this veil. This is one of those paintings. It's called Window. It's 26 by 26. It has, it's oil paint and whatnot. And it kind of, it was this turning point for me where the kind of mounded object that kind of readily showed itself in the previous work as the character, I got kind of tired of it. I call it the hump. I was tired of that as like a template, and started to think about how to make it not so volumetric, how to not make it so figurative. but make it, or situate it in the painting in such a way that would make it, at times very volumetric, but then empty, in some a portal. And trying to figure out, how to do that, I do this, you stand back, I do that, I realized that all I did was made a window, and if I would have knew from the beginning all I was going to do was make a window, I would have just made a window. This one also separated itself significantly from some previous paintings, in that I was starting to see the benefit in the painting on the wall functioning as an object all unto itself as an isolated event, in addition to a pictorial event. And so the interior aspect, the interior part of this window is spray paint and speckled oil paint. And the silver spray paint, when the painting is lit, it's hard to tell on slide like most things, it moves, like it changes, it refracts and reflects light differently. And as you move around it, the object itself moves, it's never the same. And I mean, call it an effect, if you will, is something that intrigued me. The other thing that really stunned me was the fact that I had entered into this architectural space and might have had a concrete area or a concrete stage to make paintings from. And so I revisited some Fra Angelico in terms of maybe trying to see if I could persuade myself into believing that he actually knew what he was doing with perspective, and knew that it wasn't, and realized that the inadequacies to certain aspects of perspective in this painting in particular wasn't because he wasn't able to do it, it was because he was so informed to the mathematical equations to perspective and space that he was able to manipulate it in such a way that it could better organize the composition. It could be used as a compositional tool to negotiate the importance of certain figurative interactions versus others. And I mean, I feel like I could talk at absolute length and bore you all to death with my local friend, Fra Angelico, but I won't do that. What I will do is just move on to the series of paintings that investigation brought forward. That investigation started to work within the context of a room. I started making these room paintings. I thought that was like the coolest thing ever. Because I was like, you know what, it's going to be flat, I'm going to have a window, and I'm going to change the position of the viewer in the room by just, changing their relationship to the window seal, or like changing their relationship to the corners, making one panel like wider than the other. This one got way too illustrative. I'll leave that alone. And then, thinking of ways of situating subtle narratives, suggestions. Like so, for example, this. I just messed up. This painting is called Creeper. It's about that creepy sweaty dude that's sitting in the window, like with this like a Kiriko dude in front. This painting is titled "How Long Has This Been Going On?" And it's about either the trying to get back into the window or kind of leaving out in the window in the middle of the night. This was the last room painting, which was kind of super important for me. It's called The Morning After. And it was important for a couple reasons. One, I had never in my life constructed a color palette like this before. I mean, I'd made red paintings prior, which I've shown, but never within this weird analogous and monochrome color space. And it really struck me because it came out of just the necessity of trying to solve a problem. And the second thing that I really enjoyed about this painting is that I inadvertently, without even consciously trying to do it, constructed something that could easily be, I constructed the dumbest thing you can make a character out of, which is a cube. It's just a regular old cube, What is that? You don't know. It's not even a pipe. It's just a thing. It's a block. It's got six sides, and I think, six sides, and you can be hacked away and all this stuff. And so, the kind of soft narrative, if there is one, is that, this was the night before, and then someone got really angry and just threw this big chunk into that window. And you as the viewer waking up to see it are somewhat in a dreamlike state where, you open up and the light's blinding you, you can't tell where things are for that split second. And that's what led me to creating such a brightly colored painting that is actually a bit more descriptive in this image than it is in a real person. Because in a real person, it's hard to quantify the saturation of color in the same way that projection does it. And so it made me start thinking about, the time that these paintings exist in terms of becoming more specific. And the time that I wanted these paintings to kind of sit within was dream space. It made the best sense to me. It was like I'm not interested in real spaces, like identifiable locations, but I am interested in specificity to where these events happen, where these collisions of individuals occur, and what is that space? And it came to me that the dream space was perfect because, at least in my dream space, like when I have dreams and stuff, there's a certain reality to it. It's real, but it's absolutely fake. Like some things abide by gravity, some things don't. I don't question it. It's believable. And so a certain nature of believability became part of how I would try to construct these images in this dream space that I didn't even know what to even call it. But it just seemed to make sense. And this painting was kind of like an isolated moment of that other painting that I was interested in. And it's called I Dream Too Much. It was essentially the kind of impetus for the show at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, which tried to contextualize this same shift in work that I'm sharing with you today. So I Dream Too Much sent me back to the drawing board again, to draw these characters with this square thing. And this was one of the first ones. And does anyone here have seen Coming to America? Eddie Murphy? Please, someone.
Yes.
Okay, and I'm like, man, really? It's like one of the best movies in life. I mean, that and like Trading Places with Dan Aykroyd. And so, I started thinking about, the next layer of specificity. And the reason why I bring up Come to America is I love that movie, especially the scene when the in-laws are over the house to the McDowell's, and the solo folks are sitting in the seat, and they get up with the jerry curls, and the jerry curls leave these big stains on the back of the seat. Well, I had an uncle. That's what he did. And we used to make fun of him all the time. I mean, to the fact now where I look back at it, I'm like, that was just cruel. I mean, knowing that he was grown and that we were kids is one thing, but we would just say horrible things. I mean, he was like a mop, too. It didn't even look like his real hair. And it's like he was doing a jerry curl to like a wig. It's just all types of wrong. And so anyhow, I don't know. I was like, one day he just got it cut. And I don't know why. Don't ask me why this is important. But I decided to make a painting about like that as a traumatic event. And so the painting is called You First. And it's one of the first paintings where I start to integrate multiple peoples, multiple subjects, I'll say, characters, if you will, in the same place, trying to think of visual conventions to make them fit within a flat space that I wanted to read pictorially from top to bottom, from left to right, but not so much frontward to backwards because I've got horrible depth of field, and I get tired of trying to figure that out. And so, he's like, you don't know if those like tears or like jerry curl juice, but he's on his way. And a lot of people getting their mouth full. I made another version of it called Self, which is another annual self-portrait. And I had to rethink that like nose thing because it was way too derivative of Clown. It was way too derivative of Guston. And something in a drawing kind of triggered this addition to, or rendition of that previous character, and this one stuck because it kind of reminded me of some modern architecture that I'm a fan of. The mop got switched out with a gestural mop of paint that could be cloud, could be somehow connected to this character. And I don't know, it's a small painting. It's like 26 by 26 or 27 by 27. And it led me to, really thinking about, well, when am I going to ever do what I want to do, which is to put these things in play in a way that's contentious, in a way that's meaningful. I'm tired of just working around the peripheral, creating the architect, creating the icon. And when am I going to really thrust these things together? And so, like in true fashion, the way I tend to work, which is through theme and variation, which is I strike a theme, work through it until it exhausts itself. And I'm like, yeah, I can't put gas in that again, so that's done. The next idea, I finally found something that I could reinvent and reinvent again, and it seemed to be the perfect thing. It all kind of sprouted from this square. And so this painting is called Viennese Waltz, and it's a painting, I think thematically, for what it's worth, about the type of cyclical relationship that one might have with their family, right? Like how at times your relationships with your closest friends are much more like family than your family, themselves. I think that's somewhat of it's somewhat of a platitude in terms of. I mean, I don't think that's anything that anyone hasn't experienced in some shape or form. But I was interested in making a painting in response to a series of stories, some of my own, some of my friends, that were about the community that you keep, and how toxic sometimes being in bad relationships can be. And I started thinking about like forms that were kind of in, or I guess I was thinking about how to get out of that cycle, and how it's almost close to impossible, because your responses to other people's actions turn into this momentous motion. It's like the momentum just kind of just like carries through. There's a word for this, and I can't think of it right now. But it's very cyclical, and so I was thinking of this painting in drawing form, and was watching Dance with the Stars. My wife loves that type of stuff, and we were watching this one celebrity couple do this dance, Viennese waltz, which is a series of constant, like pirouettes that happen in separate, like each person does their own pirouette, but then collectively they operate in a circle. And I thought that if someone kicked the leg the wrong way, someone was going to lose an eye, and it's going to fall apart. And it seemed to be the best premise to kind of make a painting about. And so, this was maybe my first stab at that. And this was at the time I had my show at King Jensen, and also at the time to step back and make a big painting again, which was this painting. It's Stick Stones or Drones. And it was a departure, it was somewhat of a test, because I didn't know how to make those previous paintings big yet. So I relied a lot on the illustrative aspects, and I just wanted to kind of give it another chance before I kind of threw everything away. Well, at this time I didn't know I was going to throw anything away, so I was just trying to get the last stab. And thought about that contentious cycle of individuals in that previous painting finally separating from each other, and the calamity that would happen if someone was looking up in the sky and saw those things kind of flying back and forth, sticks and stones, and every so often a geometric cloud like a drone was sifting through the atmosphere relatively undetected. Yeah, it was great. I liked it, but it didn't satisfy my wants like those other paintings. And I started thinking about what else I was missing from painting. And I started going back to the history books and started thinking about the qualities of those Amy Silverman paintings and those Guston paintings, and thinking of how they would exist together. And I came across this artist not too long ago, Sergej Jensen. He's a Danish painter who paints in New York and Berlin right now. And he's, a postmodernist painter. And his paintings are sometimes made with paint, sometimes made with other materials, pigments, seasonings, and woven stuff together. But they have, this quality of like onus, like this everything is working together. Like everything's copacetic. There's all these differences that happen, structurally speaking. But the harmony is so thick and dense that you can't see one thing without seeing the other. It's like things aren't being taken for granted. And I don't make paintings like this per se, but I like how these paintings function. I revisited Picabia, those earlier Cubist paintings. One, because of the color palette I was still attracted to, and the type of odd network that happens within these structures. I felt that I could potentially give my structures the same types of complexities, think about them differently. And then I revisited. I'm going to put out here and show a quick I'm going to show a quick clip of this video that I have, but I was unsuccessful in ripping a clip from it that's embedded. So I took, this is off the SF MoMA website. It's just a 3-minute Philip Guston. I've seen this like 1,000 times, and I tend to show this to my class, or my intermediate and advanced painting class, like the full documentary once a year, along with some other very juxtaposing documentaries to kind of expand notions of whatever. And it gives me the opportunity to see it every year, and I love it. And so when I saw this again around that same time, the one thing that I never thought I disagreed with, I started to disagree with, and just opened up a litany of stuff.
There's some mysterious process at work here which I don't even want to understand. I know that if I stopped painting and became a psychologist of the process of making, I would probably understand it more, but it wouldn't do me any good. I don't want to understand it like that, analytically. But I know that there's some working out that takes place in time, but it's not given to me to completely understand it. It's illegal. The first thing always looks good, and then you start doubting it, you know.
All right, so, it's kind of an abrupt, way to end that clip, I think, but, I isolate that moment because he says some very interesting things to me. He says, painting is a mystery. I don't want to understand it. It's not for me to understand it. I don't want to understand it that way. Painting's analytical. I don't understand it analytically. And I'm like, really? Like, you mean tell me you've been making paintings all this long, you haven't been thinking about what you do? Or thinking about how you contextualize the information that you're acquiring through all the different ways that you mediate space around you? And it's not that I don't believe him, because I do feel that as a sincere ideology of the folks that existed in the world of modern painting. The idea of them being a vessel that somehow or another transcendentally they generate this great stuff, and they are empowered in the moment to figure out what's good and what's bad. But I realize that I'm just not that type of artist, and I do want to understand things analytically, and I do want to understand the mystery of painting and demystify it, at least for myself. And believe me, it's not that much of a mystery. It's just mud and some other stuff. And so it sent me to thinking about other artists. I mean, I feel like I've got photos of artists I like looking at. This is one of them. His name is Jack Lincoln. He's an awesome painter. He's about 78 years old, lives in Tribeca. Shows with Alexander Grayson Associates. And he is from Birmingham, Alabama. Is studied law school and said, no, I'm a painter. This is a picture of him in the studio. And I had the fortune of exhibiting with him in Houston for this Black and Abstract show, Soft Edges, Hard Curves. And he did this talk, what have you, and he got me really thinking about some of the same things I was thinking about maybe a couple of months ago, or like last year. Where is the analytical approach to painting as a process? How does that fit into the overall studio practice? And it was like, well, I want to control things, but where do you place that? Do you place it in the kind of like letterhead of your studio practice? Like, do you really control the materials you're going to use, how it's going to function, or do you put it somewhere in the middle, or whatever? I don't know. And I kind of looked to him because his works are extremely uncontrolled, it seems. They're very just there. And I'm kind of attracted to that. But he controls his paintings a lot. He builds platforms on the floor that allow paint to settle in certain ways. In this picture, he has this painting right, which is about 8.5 feet tall or long, and it's got a strip of wire. Well, that's not very about it. I don't know how to do this. There we go. Pressure. I should turn it on. Anyhow, and on this metal strip that's in there, he has like it perforated, like pliers every 1/8 of an inch or something like that. He'll put the paint down and he'll pull it, so he's very calculated with his approach, but then after that he just kind of lets the paintings do what they do. And what that meant to me was that, he kind of doesn't let things, he doesn't take things for granted. That's what that meant to me, that he considers more aspects of the making of his paintings than I do. And I'm like, well, wow, there's so many things I take for granted that I just say, oh, that's just what it is. And for some reason, the first thing was the square. It was, the shape of the canvas. And, it was something that I had been contemplating for a while as being something to do, but I didn't quite understand how to even inform, where to even start with trying to come up with real reasons to shape a canvas, other than just making it fancy. I think like a lot of the shaped canvases from, the 70s and 80s as being, a real like representation of like privilege and the ability to do these new things and trying to create, large statements. And I think that's all been fine. And I think everyone had their own reason for doing it, but I didn't want to put myself in the conversation of trying to work against that or work in response to it, I wanted to think of a more potent reason to, or more potent to what I wanted out of a painting to inform the shape of the canvas. And so I started thinking about the lack of physicality or the lack of figurative painting in my paintings. That previous painting was titled "To Juliet's Big City Dream." It's 27 by 27 approximately, and this is a piece called "Honest Boy," another riff off this cube structure. But I was thinking, about kind of emotive attributes that can be assigned to these shapes. That certain shapes could be aggressive, right? They could kind of feel like they're coming out of a square, and others could feel as if they were once a square and they just tumbled around, and over time just kind of disintegrating down to this other weird, wonky shape. I saw it as the opportunity to do, in a more intentional way, what I was doing in that earlier painting, Window, where I was struggling, trying to make that hump form both figure and space at the same time. That the contradictory realities between what the paint was pictorially describing in the painting and what the shape was suggesting was great fodder for trying to convey juxtaposing and contradicting realities between individuals. This is a black painting titled "Night Baptism." A funny story, and I'll make it a little later, but it has to do with before I got married, I did wedding license. My wife was like, she wouldn't get married in the church, in the Catholic church, on the altar. And so, I grew up in this, the Baptist church, and we don't have all these documents, so I'd go get rebaptized at night. And I mean, not to say that I was traumatized by that experience, but it's something very disconcerting, being in all the way around children this big in a line, ready to get baptized. And so, I mean, it happened that night. I actually flew out to Washington to do this, and then go back to work the next day. And I couldn't get it out of my head, so I had to make a painting about, kind of, I don't know, being baptized, and like me and 6 other people this big. But it got me to really thinking about the differences that I was finding in my work at the time. And I don't really read statements too much in my lectures, but this is so fresh to me that I don't know how to articulate it other than in text. And I think the one thing that I realized was a shift. The shift in my painting is being a result of focusing on pictorially conceiving an architectural landscape of psychological and physical stasis. In doing so, I've honed in on the relative values of paint as a state of stability, where all and working mechanisms are equal and opposing, canceling out each other. Right? So once again, that idea of conflict, painterly conflict, not being able to identify the role of one surface of paint or recognizable object of paint in space, trying to kind of really complicate these relationships to infer on how I perceive my relationships with those around me. As a viewing experience, I believe this is a better representation of the cyclical, unsolvable realities found in our common human experience, e.g. society, culture, and culture, etc. I've shifted perhaps temporarily into thinking about an object on the wall that carries meaning in its physical presence and mediates meaningful experiences with its audience by creating anxiety over how to approach it. And I kind of stole that last part from a definition of what it means to have social anxiety and not know how to approach someone or a situation. And I think that in thinking of how I'm warping these canvases and thinking of the contradictory spaces that are being portrayed in them, ultimately I'm trying to, honestly, change the way people approach these things. I want my audience to approach these paintings without relying on so much previous history. I want the painting, in essence, to be one of those dumb objects that have very little baggage in them. I want an honest opinion. I want an honest assertion. I want to see these up in space and see people do this and not really know how to even approach it. For some reason, that's important to me. It's like a fresh start. At the same time those were going on, I was making a series of these drawings. Sometimes drawings take a kind of a back seat in the studio in terms of just being, subsidiaries to the painting experience. And every so often, they'll start to challenge the paintings. And in a very monochromatic way, these start to help me deal with some of the paintings that I'll show after. I don't really have titles for these. They're 6 by 6 inches. They're graphite on paper, on like Arches 300, so they're really kind of thick. And they're very faint. And my idea was to try to keep, to try to build off this idea of the monochrome and make that image that exists in the painting even more illusionistically not present as much as it was present, so that you could see something, and once you locked onto it and defined it, you lose it if you try to focus on something else. And that, you know, like those earlier Jensen paintings, that same experience I had with trying to, you know, destabilize one point from another became impossible because everything was relative to each other. Almost like the experience you get when you look at Daniel Hessenen's painting. This is a really big abstraction. And it's something about that form that exists right in the middle that's not here or there. It just kind of transcendentally sits there. I don't know why, but that just makes sense to me. This painting is called Best Kept Secret. It's about 48 by 48. And it's, I don't know, it's like these two characters conspiring amongst each other, you know, underneath this veil as if you can't see. It's like they think they've got the invisible cloak. That's not visible. This is a kind of broken, fractured version of that character, kind of sprawled out in a black trash bag. It's called Layaway. 66 by 66. This one is called Night Twitch. And it's about stuff that keeps you up at night, things that anger you, things that make you, you know, like respond. It typifies how one might respond to the aggravations of dealing with the politics of you know, human disposition. This painting is titled Nightmare, which I was thinking about literal nightmares, like, you know, flying horses through the night that, you know, mount themselves when you're resting, make you not move, give you a hard time breathing, which creates the anxiety of a nightmare. I mean, that doesn't really happen in the real world, but like in medieval times, that was like the reason why people had night terrors. This painting is called Night Mass, and deals with, like, you know, structure that was a little different from all the other ones. All the other ones seemed to be kind of actualized in their existence, meaning it was a dark square or a red or orange cube or what have you. Night Mass, I started changing my kind of the ideology around how these structures could be more dynamic. I don't want to use the word complex yet because I'm still in the midst of working on this, so I don't know if it's really more complicated or just, you know, different. And so, you know, I think I'm thinking more or less about the existence of these objects in much more of a, maybe a phenomenological point of view, or a Sizekian parallax view, which would suggest that our understanding of the space is, I guess, in more or less words, is typical to our disposition to it, meaning that, you know, these objects start to become reflections of their environments. I started to think about these shapes that I was building at the time. I just realized I should have produced some images of those in order to cast and paint from, were wrapped in some type of reflective material. And that's why the red paintings were red on red, and that's why the black paintings were black on black. But I wanted to try to take a more direct approach and make that more purposeful. Alongside of that, in terms of this notion of the amount of precision that is become part of this project, I mean, making shapes, getting them made, stretching those canvases, I mean, you're stuck with that. And so you really have to flesh things through. I've just recently moved back into an older practice of just kind of letting things go, just letting things happen. And so I've been working on a series of works on paper, and this is like really fresh, like these are actually still wet. Oil paint on Kodachrome paper, 26 by 40 inches. And it's pretty interesting because the paper itself is super slippery. It's super slick and it's used in commercial printing. And when the oil paint sits on it, you can't control it. It does what it's going to do. And it's something pretty, I don't know, I haven't quite been able to contextualize it, but it's something that I've been doing. It's actually been helping me redefine dynamic relationships between what I perceive as being kind of like atmospheric space or background space, and what I think of being as object and form. And they'll work their way, they've already worked their way into some of my more recent paintings, but it's something about just gestural painting that I can't get away from. I don't try to, you know, I'm no longer interested in trying to work myself out of these things. You are what you are, just like you can't choose what you love, you can't choose the things that inspire you to make art. You just have to figure out how to implement it. This is one of the paintings that I attributed from that first series of drawings. It's called Night Orchestra. It's about kind of being up and high in an orchestra booth and being uplifted on the stage. This is titled Copycat. It's a fairly recent painting. It's about a series of objects that are treading this relatively digital space that's totally inspired by the transition tool in Photoshop, and also clad in some type of reflective material and then draped with a blue painting. I haven't quite figured out what that means. I just think it's cool. And this is another painting titled Exposed, which is kind of a response to a response that people were having with those other paintings. I realized that those black paintings, many of them had entire red paintings underneath that were kind of sheathed in black, thin layers of covering it up. And if you know, I'm a big fan of letting the process just kind of exist. And I'm not interested in trying to allude to the fact that these images magically appear on the canvas, and so my edges are really kind of janky looking. They're not all that pristine. And people will come up to me and say, "Wow, I think there's something very interesting that's happening underneath this painting. What is it?" I'm like, "I don't really know. I just needed something warm to offset the heaviness of the black to make sure it was still saturated." And I worked it out in red and then achieved it. And then someone wrote about it and started to write about this. Kind of like weird, inconspicuous theory of crap that existed underneath the painting, how important it was to cover it up. And so I wanted to make a painting that just kind of lifted its painting up, and all it was just another one of those red squares. It took me into thinking about making images. This is the most recent painting that I've made. I finished it maybe a week ago, and I threw it in here because those earlier drawings are starting to show up in this work in terms of the quiet nature of the image and the idea of these things kind of disappearing into space and being there and not being there. And this is kind of my first attempt at it. I still think it's a hair bit too contrasty, but I do like the effect of what happens with the subtle dimensionality to this one centralized form. So wrapping this up into the kind of last, the kind of end of the talk, I just want to take a few seconds to talk about where I am now in terms of where I want to go next. When I was in Houston, it was the first time I had seen the works, at least the shape canvases, outside the studio. Well, I mean, that's kind of a lie, because I saw them in Momoka, but they were around. I mean, the curator did such a good job of making that show about this trajectory that I couldn't see these paintings together. And the idea of having them correspond together on the wall, and somewhat of a subtle ode to wall installation, was very real to me when I kind of came up with the gall to go forward with making shaped canvases. And so to see them on the wall next to each other started to do something funny in my head, and to see them amongst other abstractions, other real abstractions, because I still don't believe that mine are truly real abstractions, because I pull them from real sources. I mean, they're still real, definitive, illusionistic spaces and whatnot. I mean, it's not like, that yellow one back there, for example, which is absolutely non-objective. So I guess it's maybe objective abstraction. I don't know, that's for someone else to figure out. But, something struck me, it was that the way these relate to each other on the wall is very similar to how I like the things on the inside relate to each other, that there might be room to move in that direction of considering, the relationship of these objects as they sit on and gesture toward each other. I mean, the whole aspect of the development of these shapes came from the idea that they were personified kind of gesture, aggressive gestures from submissive pictures. And so I think that there's space for that. The orientation of theme and variation. On that same flight back to Madison from Houston, I was watching a documentary on Moorish architecture, and this came up, and I didn't see it at first, but the stewardess ran down with the cart and just nailed me in the elbow. And so I stopped and rewound it, and I stopped on this image, and it was one of those kind of eureka moments where I was like, man, this is a good example of what I'm talking about. where there's subtle variation between these three forms. I started to think about the idea of there being, more subtle variations from painting to painting that, when put together on a wall, will start to, speak to a group dynamic. And that kind of happened in the show in Birmingham, which was the first opportunity I've seen to see all of these in scale and next to each other. And the weird conversation that happened around these pieces on the wall, where there were no level or plumb lines other than the floor and the ceiling. And at the current moment, I'm working on more of those protochrome paper drawings and thinking about individual little small shapes and kind of lighting them differently so that I can isolate some of these for individual paintings. So for example, like one of these chunks, like I could create a composition where they work together, where they're all in harmony together, and then kind of isolate them out and make individual paintings out of them, where their likeness helps fortify the differences that define their individual shapes. And here's the most recent one that's a little more wonky. That's it. So, thank you. All right, so I think I did that in the right time. Thank you. Right, I said 5 after 8, and I think I nailed it. I don't feel bad. So I'll take questions. If anyone has anything they want to ask. I guess I can't really see, so if you've got a question, just yell it out.
How do you establish your investigations? You kind of explained some of it, aside from the visual, the recommendation, the idea. How do you establish your investigation?
That's a good question. I think for me, it always goes back to what the things that I'm interested in. I think I got to a point in time in the making of art that I had to realize that what I was interested in on a day-to-day basis, the literature and politics and stuff, was only something that I liked. That my work didn't have to be that. It could be informed by it, but it didn't have to be that. And once I made that once I distinguished between, like the difference between like what I was interested in just as a person, and what I wanted to be kind of the subject and content, it just sent me into trying to figure out ways to validate those other interests. So like just informing myself as much as possible on the histories behind all of these things. Approaching it as if, yes, it has been done before, these things have been talked about before, but I'm interested in finding what I agree with and finding out what I don't agree with in order to create a spectrum to identify the niche that represents where I might sit on an issue. For example, an issue that deals with abstract expressionism, or the issue of geometric abstraction, or the issue of whether or not abstraction is it still viable to hold or to contain emotive values, And so my research and everything just stems from, finding one thing and then saying, oh, I figured that out, and then saying, well, but there's this other thing that I haven't even looked at. And so it's like a good reading list, you get 4 books that you really want to read, and by the time you finish reading the first one, you got a whole list of other books that book used in the back, so you source those to get a better idea of that book, and then by the end of the week, your book list is like a trillion books, and it just never stops. It's like this, I find that the stuff that I'm reading about right now has nothing to do with what I'm actually doing in the studio, because I can't make the work that fast. It's like if I could make it and actualize it as quickly, and I'm not a fast reader, but it's just it's easier to like read it and say, oh, that would be a great idea. But I'm like, I don't even have the framework to make that painting, right? Because I haven't even worked through the trenches to figure out even how to build the chassis that would support an idea like that. Like this chassis I got here is like super weak. I need to fortify it. So that's what keeps me kind of back in the studio trying to figure out how to, make the painting as strong as possible to be able to withstand the responsibilities I want to give it in the future. Does that help? Cool.
There's a question over there.
Okay.
I noticed that in your more recent work, your canvases weren't perfectly square. How do you build them?
That's good. You know, I usually have an image I've shown. I took it out because I was trying to, save on time and not get lost. And, no, it's not up there. I thought it was up in that picture. But, I tried to build one myself because I like building things, like shelves and stuff, things that go like this. I like building those because they're very easy to do. And I tried building one, got a jigsaw and built one of these shapes, and it looked pretty bad. And I realized instantly that one, I'd rather spend my time painting, and that I'm not a carpenter, and that was very hard to swallow. And so what I started to do is to take advantage of my location, which was Madison. I'm in a place where, I'm doing things now that I couldn't possibly do anymore. And that's one of the many reasons why I love being out here. And so what I do is I sit down and I draw the shapes out, I figure them out in the sketchbook, rudimentary stuff. Do I want it to be bulbous? Do I want it to go in like these newer shapes, like that red one there and that one straight one on the side, are made up of all concave gestures, where everything before that were all convex, going outward gestures. And so I decide those things first, like what kind of physical stance. Do I want this to be something, an object on the wall that people are going to want to get up and close with, or is this something I want people to see from a distance? And once I figure that out, I scan it into the computer, make it a vector, tweak it, do the things that technology affords us the opportunity to do. And then there's this this small furniture studio called Drift Studios in Madison, and one of the people that works there and works the CNC router also teaches a kind of digital class similar to the ones you have here for digital printers and all that jazz. And working with him, we've been able to come up with so far 2 generations of how these things can operate. The first one was a dual system of laminated Baltic birch plywood, which worked, but they were so heavy. There's 13 layers of ply. And right now I've moved to like a cabinetry, furniture grade plywood that gets in, the file gets sent over to him, and he cuts it out. And there's voids. It's definitely more of a it's a strainer, not a stretcher, because it's in a fixed shape. It's not going to move, but it's not a panel. So I still have the luxury of the bounce of canvas that I love so much. So that's kind of the process that I use. They're all beveled underneath, just like any other canvas stretcher bars that you purchase. They're just kind of shaped like that. As far as stretching, I just watch some YouTube on like upholstery, and just stretching and upholstering a chair is not too different from each other. And some of these round edges and trying to get seamless folds. There's craftsmen out there that can do that on some of the hardest, softest shapes. And so, although I know at times people are kind of mystified at how these exist, they're very simple. They're very simple.
I noticed that your titles seem to be very important to your works, and I was wondering if you could just expand more on that, like the relationship of a title of a work to a title of an abstract work.
Sure. I think for me that's something that I'm constantly working on. I don't like titling things because I just want people to get it. Like I'm one of those folks that just want everyone to read my mind and just know what I'm thinking. And that's not realistic. My wife has made that apparent over and over again. And so it translates into the artwork because I realize that without description, these paintings sometimes just don't function. I know that every painting I make isn't the best painting. It might be nice, it might satisfy aesthetic, it might function in a way that's new to me, but it might not best represent my intentions. And I do feel that sometimes something as simple as a suggestive title can aid in locating someone to the painting, assuming that they read it. Essentially, the work has to operate on its own 2 feet when it's out there. And people are going to respond to it the way they're going to respond to it, and that's fine. But I think, oh man, I haven't titled any of those, but have a painting like Copycat, where there's these 2 forms. In my mind, I was thinking that perhaps someone would get caught in trying to identify the differences, that one was trying to copy the other, that one was more important than the other, that one was more ideal than the other, that one was trying to assimilate into the same shape and form as the other. and kind of deal with trying to understand their relationships. Whereas if I titled it like, I don't know, Blue Mist or something, maybe that might not be part of the viewing experience for someone investigating the painting. So I think in short, I try to use the titles as ways to very subtly condition the experience, condition the ideas that might come to mind when you could assert the text to the image. They function very similar, like function in reverse of like fictive narrative writing, where you're able to go to that visual place, and that visual place is full of all these things that you've created, and that's why it's better than any kind of like made-for-TV movie. But in reverse, meaning that I'm making that image, but I have the one opportunity of text to get you there.
I want to go back to canvases really quick. You mentioned that you want these things to either, you think about if you want them to be approached or viewed from far away. Does that inform what you paint on them?
Good question. That's been an area of contention for me in the studio. Is like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? What comes first, the idea, and then you go out and build these structures, and then you realize you want to change your ideas. What do you do? What do you do with this shape that's supposed to do this one thing? And so I haven't really figured that out yet. I don't know how that works. Sometimes this is what I do. This is what I've been doing. This is how I've been dealing with it. I order 2 to 3 shapes at a time that are drastically different from each other. So I've got one that's super aggressive, one that's super that I think is a very submissive shape. One that's like got impressions in it versus one that makes the impressions. And I take those drawings of the things that happen in the empty page space of a notebook that has no boundaries. Essentially, it's just like that's why the drawings always look better than the sketchbook, because you don't think of the 4 sides so much. And I think of what attributes, what would be the best fit for that. And then, it's just a point of responding to that drawing in the painting, making it acquiesce to the conditions of that shape. So that if there is a juxtaposing element of a shape not fitting or a form not quite sitting accurately to the form, it's because I've wanted it that way, not because, it's like, it doesn't fit because I got the wrong shape or something like that. So it's kind of hard for me to think that far in advance in terms of preconceiving how these things are going to actually turn out. And so I just futz with them until, that's what I do. I just kind of futz with them until they start to meld, right? And start to come together in isolated form. That's kind of how I think about it. Is that answer?
So in a lot of the recent work, you're using all the signifiers from geometric abstraction or post-paleolithic abstraction. I'm just wondering, how do you consider the work you're making now to be meaningfully different from that first wave of geometric abstraction, or how do you think about that?
Well, I think when I think about geometric abstraction as being a response to post-minimalism. You think of like Peter Haley, for example. Right? His kind of collection of Neo-Geo. From my experience, personal experience with the work, interesting conversation with these folks, it feels like there's an absence of the self, right? It's like a total type of manufactured sensibility that ties into a much more factory-based condition for the painting. So you think of Jonathan Lasker, think of Peter Haley, you think of Bryce Martin, and that is kind of like a spectrum of a conversation that deals with post-painterly abstraction and then geometric abstraction approach. Am I following you right? Okay. So for me, I think aesthetically right now, these works can absolutely become lost within that conversation. I had a studio visit not too long ago, and this one curator called me out flat for it. He was like, "Well, this just seems like old news. What do you do with that?" And I just had to say, well, that's the big elephant in the room. And the way I see it as being different is that my intentions for this work is different. And when my intentions are made manifest in these pieces, or the ones that I think are most successful, I do feel that your being the audience's experience with those paintings visually is packed with a certain amount of familiarity, a certain amount of like, I know this, I know what this is, I can put my finger on this, I feel connected to this object, maybe not emotionally, maybe formally, but I don't think those were concerns that were necessarily on the platter for, like, you know, geometric abstractionists. I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, that's like, I'm not pulling that out of any text. That's just my own, you know, like, this is just the way I feel about it, kind of thing. Meaning that it could be unfair. That's all I'm saying. Is there some other question back there?
One more question over there.
You kind of were talking about how you sort of don't go into some ideas because there's a lot of legwork and you're kind of into other ideas, if I'm kind of getting that right. Like you kind of have to do more of the trench work to get through certain ideas. I was just kind of wondering, like, about the process, like how much research do you do? I know you said you had some of your paintings were more political. Do you do a lot of back research for that, or do you do a lot of sketching, or do you kind of just jump right into the painting?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, I really envy artists who have patience. I mean, I work with oil, and that requires already a number of patience, I think. But I envy, you know, I go to lectures sometimes and I see artists who, they're very methodical, like how they digest their information, and they phrase their a series of paintings as a project, right? And I like that as a template, because it, in my mind, it means that it's very organized, that you do a certain amount of research, and you say, okay, got it. Now let me execute it. And then you respond to whatever comes out of that, and use that to make the next question for the project. I can't for the life of me work in that fashion. I tend to just want to start painting, and so what tends to happen is that I might a concept, something that I think is really intriguing, might not make itself onto the stage of the studio for a couple of years. And you know, I don't mean that in a romantic sense that I'm like backlogged with ideas, because that's not the truth. I just like to keep a number of interesting things in a queue that I don't expect to look any way, right? I don't know what they're gonna look like. There's just a queue of things, triggers, prompts, ideas that I find interesting, that are somehow connected to the underlying structure of all of these things, all of these paintings. And as I move through the kind of physical nature of developing a series of paintings, and I start to become familiar with how they're functioning, and I think of finding ways of either reinventing it or opening it up and exploring it even more, I go to that queue and I'm like, you know what would be perfect for this? I think that as an idea, how would that look if it had to be forced into these aesthetic situations? Like, what would that breed? You know, what would that make? And then it starts a new cycle of exploration. So it's like the I don't know. I try to keep it like the U.S. Postal Service. You're never finished. You get there at work in the morning and there's mail, and you leave and there's mail. There's just always mail. It's always coming. There's always leaving. And that's just the way it is. I've kind of just learned to deal with the anxiety and be okay with not wanting to drop everything and start something totally new every time. Because there was a portion of time, I selectively took that work out of this lecture, where like every time I got another great idea, I was like, I just dropped stuff. Okay, this must be stupid. So now I got to redevelop this whole thing, and I realized that was very limiting. Maybe I was missing things. I felt the feeling of missing the potential of something was much more of an anxiety than dealing with a new idea that I knew, I could potentially still do to.
Leslie, thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. Before we give him the proper round of applause, I just want to mention that he'll be around a little bit. If you have more questions you want to interact, come on up and do that. Those of you that are in the class, we'll take a 10-minute break and then we'll start up again. So thank you very much.